Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 112 Introduction to Criminology. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. And tonight's lecture is going to cover Chapter 3, where we are going to take a closer look at victims and victimization. What do we hope to get out of tonight? What are some of the objectives? Well, first of all, we're going to take a closer look at the victim's role in the entire crime process and see how that fits in. We're going to look at and discuss some of the general problems that are typically faced by crime victims. You can ask yourself when you're a victim of a crime, is only one person impacted, or can there be more? And if there are more, what type of issues are those? We're going to clarify and kind of define this phrase, this term that maybe we've heard before, called the cycle of violence. We're also going to take a look at what is known as the ecology of victimization, meaning is there a different rate of victimization in certain parts of the state and in certain parts of the United States, or when it's cold or warm, etc. We're going to categorize and kind of analyze and take a closer look at some of the more dominant victim characteristics, and separate those out. And then finally, we'll wrap it all up with comparing and contrasting some of the more important theories of victimization. So that's kind of our plan for tonight. So let's go ahead and jump right into our fact or fiction. And again, this is something that we do at the beginning of every chapter, and I may or may not answer the question as we go through, but it's important to kind of get your brain stimulated and get you thinking. So here we go. Fact or fiction. Men are more likely to become victimized by strangers, women by someone they know. Kind of an interesting thought. And then number two, fact or fiction. Most crime victims are just people who are simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. And kind of think about that as we jump into tonight's lecture. So we'll start off with talking, of course, about the victim's role, but why do some people become targets of predatory criminals? Is it because their lifestyle and the environment they're in? Could the victim have done more to protect themselves? Or is it unfair to expect some individuals to always be on their guard, especially maybe when their attackers turn out to be someone that they've trusted? So it's kind of an interesting thing when we look at this whole victimization thing and the role that victims are going to play on that. So for many years, crime victims were viewed by criminologists as merely the passive targets of a criminal's anger or greed or frustration, and they were considered to have been kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, more than 50 years ago, a number of criminologists, including an individual by the name of Hans von Henting and Stephen Schaefer, conducted some pioneering studies that found, contrary to popular belief, the victim's own behavior is an important piece of the entire crime process, and that victims influence criminal behavior by playing an active role in the criminal incident. For example, possibly provoking someone during an assault that ended in their death. And victims were also found to sometimes play an indirect role in a criminal incident, such as when they maybe travel through or visit or are in a dangerous high crime neighborhood at night without any companionship or protection. So the discovery that victims play an important role in the crime process has really prompted a scientific study. So kind of backtracking and rephrasing some of that so you can soak all that in. There is some research on males and females that indicate a strong association between victimization and personality traits. And would you happen to know what that personality trait might be? Well, we'll kind of throw it in there now and we'll get into it a little bit deeper, but it's impulsiveness. And we know that there's been research on differences between men and women, and how they think and how they act and who communicates better and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, we can throw in the old kind of funny picture of how simple men are. Sorry, guys, where it's kind of like just a on-off switch, and possibly how complicated women are with all kinds of different switches and knobs and things like that. So these are important things, and we can even equate a lot of this as we go further into the lecture and we talk more about age or gender or marital status or any of those things that play a role in crime. So yes, there is the victims do play a role, if you will, and I've kind of thrown some pictures up there that you can look at. And you have to, it's not always the wrong place at the wrong time. But think about it. Are you one of those people that go to the ATM at midnight by yourself, and you get out of the car and walk up to the ATM? Or do you have some type of situational awareness, and you kind of look around and you pay attention to these things, and you kind of set up barriers and things like that to try to lessen the possibility of victimization. So again, is it because of their lifestyle or environment? Could people do more to protect themselves? And again, we know that we've kind of said it already, that sometimes, criminologists used to view victims as these passive targets of somebody's anger and greed, etc. And they were, you were just at the wrong place at the wrong time. But I think we know different. And re-summarizing here, we know that a couple of criminologists did some very interesting pioneering studies that showed us, or brought forth some data that kind of showed us that, victims influence criminal behavior by playing an active role in it. And depending upon, we gave a couple of examples. One, again, provoking the assault that maybe ended their life. Maybe there's an argument and somebody provoked somebody to do something. I hate, throwing this photo in here, but I'm just going to give you the reality. This was a case that was worked, and it's already been solved, so I can put the picture in here. But this started off as a simple argument. And one individual was provoking the other one, and the other individual got a firearm and ended up shooting and killing the person. So, these things are real. So there was a little bit of role, and both of these individuals were drinking. So, we're not blaming the other person. We're just saying that the victim can play a part in that. And again, being at the wrong place at the wrong time, there's this thought that victims were also found to play an indirect role in a criminal incident because maybe, again, they're driving through a dangerous neighborhood without any type of, without somebody with them. What your parents used to tell you all the time, when you would go somewhere at night, well, take somebody with you, take your friend, etc. So, there's kind of a rationale for that. So, with that being said, and we've kind of had a little summary about the victim's role, let's define a couple of important terms. So, we're going to look at, in this chapter, the victims and their relationship again to this criminal justice process, but the discovery that victims play an important role in the crime process has prompted the study of a couple of different areas. The first one is victimology, and that's the study of the victim's role in criminal events. And then the next definition would be victimologists. And these are criminologists who focus on the victims of crime. So you can see one is a little more broad than the other. So what about the cost of victimization? So if you remember when I started talking that, when when somebody, let's say there's a homicide, so we have a victim, is that the only victim, or is there more? Is there some type of toll that this crime is going to impact others? So criminal victimization does in fact exact a very heavy toll on all whom it touches. Now, both the general society and its direct target, individual victims. So both of those. The cost of victimization does take many forms, ranging from financial loss to property losses, productivity losses, medical bills to personal losses, stress, fear, emotional trauma, and pain. And we're going to kind of look at a bunch of these different kind of sub areas, or the costs of victimization. So while it does take a significant toll, because again, there are many expenses are associated with each crime, there are going to be direct tangible costs, and there are going to be indirect intangible costs. And I kind of went through a list, but here's maybe a larger one with a couple of extras. We do have financial loss and property loss and productivity loss and medical bills. We could say medical loss and personal loss and the stress and the fear and the emotional trauma and the pain that comes along with all of this stuff. Now, a number of different methods have been developed to measure the cost of victimization in American society and how that cost influences the average American. Now, Mark Cohen first pioneered these efforts by focusing on the total cost of a criminal act rather than, let's say, the out-of-pocket expenses incurred by victims. And in this study, Cohen used some complex mathematical models to estimate the additional cost of such intangibles like things like pain and suffering and fear caused by crime, and let's say what a jury might award in a personal injury case for similar injuries. And Cohen's analysis determined that the typical criminal causes about 1.3 to 1.5 million in economic costs, and so on. Now, a little bit later, there was some additional research. So in the aftermath of Cohen's research, a number of other or different measures were created to gauge the cost of victimization. And another individual, Catherine McAllister, and her associates determined that the costs of victimization included a lot of things. It included the justice system and healthcare and other costs. And some of the crimes they actually thought about, one was homicide, and we'll talk about the average numbers. So the cost to society of an average murder was determined to be about $9 million. And if you kind of think about it, considering that about 16,000 Americans are victims of murder each year across the United States, this particular crime all by itself costs the nation about $190 billion in losses each year. And that's just for that. But even these huge costs may be only, let's say, the tip of the iceberg. There was another individual, Michael Tonry, and he reminds us that such efforts ignore the social costs of punishment that are levied on offenders and their families. Imprisoning a convicted criminal does place an economic burden on the family, who thereafter may need government assistance and welfare. And because there is a significant correlation between parental incarceration and children's delinquency, incarcerating parents may actually create more victimization than it saves. Parental absence due to incarceration has a greater effect on kids than parental separation due to illness, death, or divorce. So again, while these factors may add to the true cost of victimization, they negate or neutralize the economic benefits accrued from incarcerating criminals. And again, that's not everybody's opinion, but it is that of some research done by Michael Tonray. So what about, let's focus in a little bit more. Let's say individual or personal costs. So some of the direct tangible costs suffered by individual victims of crime include, again, the cost of damaged property or damaged or lost property, pain, suffering, costs of medical care, lost wages, reduced quality of life imposed by, let's say, an injury, or even the fear of being victimized again, and the cost of psychological counseling if you need some help for this. And a couple of other individuals by the name of Lynn Langton and Jennifer Truman found that more than 2/3, or about 68%, of serious violent crime victims experienced socio-emotional problems, including things like stress, anxiety, and fatigue, leading to emotional distress, increased relationship issues, and disruption at school and even work. So, a lot of different things. Some victims, of course, are physically disabled, including those who suffer paralyzing injuries, and they might need long-term medical care. And the long-term effects of crime may have some devastating financial consequences. There was one recent interview study that assessed the economic impact of sexual assaults using data from 27 in-depth qualitative interviews with rape survivors. And Rebecca Loya found that trauma can disrupt survivors' employment in several ways, including forcing victims to take time off, and which diminishes their job performance once they return. There are also a lot of hidden costs. Take for example, or for instance, the decline in the value of a house that had been the scene of a murder. The impact of a high-profile murder on real estate can be devastating. Take the O.J. Simpson case, the Brentwood, California home where Nicole Brown Simpson, the wife of O.J. at the time, and her friend Ron Goldman were murdered in 1994. Hit the market the following year, the house did, with a $795,000 price tag. It sat for more than 2 years and sold for $595,000. So that was a financial impact. And finally, under this socio-emotional problems area, we have to look at something like post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, something you've heard of before. Victims may suffer stress and anxiety long after the incident is over and the justice process has run its course. Some individuals, Langdon and Truman, did some research and found that most violent crime victims with socio-emotional problems suffered from symptoms such as feeling anxious or depressed or angry, or having trouble sleeping for at least a month or more after the incidents. And again, many suffered from long-term PTSD, symptoms which include things like depression, anxiety, self-destructive behavior, especially when the victim does not receive adequate support from family and friends. So a lot of things that fall underneath this particular area. There's also relationship stress. Let's say the stress encountered in childhood endures into adulthood, especially for those who are the victim let's say, of partner violence. People who were abused as a youth are more likely to become involved in abusive relationships as they mature. Now, that's not everybody, it's just more likely. And early victimization has attached to it what is referred transformative effect, making childhood victims extremely vulnerable to partner violence when they form co-residential romantic unions, etc. So a lot of things again that comes out of it. So we've kind of gone through the socio, the personal level costs. Now let's move into something victim fear. What about it? Well, people who live in crime-ridden neighborhoods do develop an overwhelming sense of fear. For those who have actually experienced crime, are the most fearful, dreading the possibility that they may be victimized again, which I could totally understand that. And fear can become generalized. People who have been assaulted may develop fears that their house will be burglarized. And there are some gender differences in the fear of crime. And typically women are more fearful than men, especially those that are living in crime-ridden neighborhoods. And those who experience victimization directly are most likely to be fearful and change their behaviors. Some choose to even move out of their neighborhood to a safer area. But even those who have escaped attack themselves may develop fears and become timid after hearing about somebody else's victimization. Not only are people likely to move out of their neighborhood if they become crime victims, but they are also likely to relocate if a friend or a neighbor has been victimized. And there are, news stories about serial killers on the rampage, or mass killers, or shootings, in movie theaters and things like that. They can cause fear in an entire city. And because of that, some may actually carry weapons for protection and may even react over aggressively or aggressively toward any type of fear or provocation. So these are other things we have to look at. And it kind of begs the question, if you will, is there such a thing called the fear of crime? And the answer is yes, there is this essence of fear of crime. And some people, if you've been victimized, you're going to experience this quite a bit more. So along with the victim fear, we have to look at victim blame. So the suffering endured by crime victims does not end when their attackers leave the scene of the crime. They may suffer innuendos, if you will, or something similar from friends and family members who might even suggest that they were to blame for what happened, or that the crime was somehow their fault. And being blamed for what others perceive to be the result of risky behavior is especially painful for sexual assault victims who may be made to feel that they were somehow responsible for the attack because they used poor judgment or took risks. Rape survivors or sexual assault survivors are often the target of negative reactions from people who are supposed to give them some support, including family and friends, and sometimes even professionals. So you have to kind of look at this entire thing. And so victims, when we talk about blame, they're especially prone to stress and blame and fear if it turns out they may have made a, let's say, false identification, and the person they thought responsible for their attack was actually not guilty. So there's a lot of different things that kind of fall in here. I posted this because this is a great, there's two video links on here. This is the case of Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Cotton. And basically, in a nutshell, she was the victim of a sexual assault. She identified Ronald Cotton as the suspect. He was convicted. He was later exonerated through DNA, and the rightful suspect was identified and arrested. And together, both of these individuals wrote a book on the issues surrounding false identification. So this is a two-part video. I would really suggest that you take a look at it. It's not mandatory, of course, but I think it will show you how she felt after this false identification or this bad identification was made. Okay, so let's move on. Well, what about legal costs? So people who are crime victims may be more likely to commit crimes themselves. That's kind of an interesting thing, and I'll kind of walk you through that. The process, of course, may begin early in life because being abused or neglected as a child increases the odds. Doesn't mean it will, but it increases the odds of, let's say, being arrested both as a juvenile and as an adult. And people who were physically or sexually abused, especially young males, are much more likely to smoke or drink or become involved in drugs than a non-abused youth. Now, this is based off of statistical information, okay? It's not me just throwing stuff out. Now, incarcerated offenders do report significant amounts of post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of prior victimization, which may in part explain their violent and criminal behaviors. It's not an excuse, it's an explanation. Some may run away, increasing their risk of becoming a crime victim. Others may seek revenge against the people who harm them. And sometimes these feelings are generalized to others who exhibit the same characteristics as their attackers. The abuse crime phenomenon that we're talking about is referred to as the cycle of violence. Now, as adults, there is evidence that crime victims themselves are more likely than non-victims to commit crimes. Fearing re-victimization, they may take drastic measures to arm themselves for self-protection. And again, such measures may amplify the risk of victimization. And some of the factors that link crime and victimization, they're listed in your textbook on page 71, but I'll read them really quick. It's victimization causes social problems. Victimization causes stress and anger. Victimization can prompt revenge. Crime and victimization have a common cause. And spurious and or nonlinear relationships. So, but let's back up real quick to the cycle of violence. Let me define it for you. Victims of crime, especially victims of childhood abuse, are more likely to commit crimes themselves. Again, based off of data, it doesn't mean that it's going to be that person's going to turn out that way, okay? But it does increase the odds. And again, just kind of rehashing the link between victimization and crime. Victimization causes social problems. It causes stress and anger. It prompts revenge. We know that crime and victimization do have somewhat of a common cause. Okay? So now let's take a look at the nature of victimization. And we'll look at that thing that we talked about earlier, that phrase, the ecology of victimization. So how many crime victims are there in the United States, and what are the trends and patterns in victimization? Well, the National Crime Victimization Survey, the NCVS, indicates that about 20 million theft and violence victimizations occur each year. And while this number has declined considerably during the past 20 years, it still means that about more than 10% of all households in America experience theft sometime during the year, and about 20 in every 1,000 citizens are sexually assaulted, robbed, or assaulted. And as we've seen, this data, or these data, are especially disturbing, considering that becoming a victim of these violent acts can not only be immediately devastating, but also have, again, a considerable long-term consequence and cost, again, ranging from damaged property to mental anguish. And patterns in these victimization surveys, the findings tell us that victimization is stable and repetitive. Victimization is not random, but a function of personal and ecological factors. And the stability of these patterns allow judgments to be made about the nature of victimization. So who are the victims, and where do these victimizations take place, and what is the relationship then between victims and criminals? So what we're going to look at now is we're going to discuss some of the most important patterns and trends, because we've asked these questions now, and now I think we have to look at it. So the first one is going to be something that we call the social ecology of victimization. Now, victim surveys show that violent crimes are slightly more likely to take place in an open public area like a street, a park, or a field, or at a commercial establishment such as a bar. And in the daytime or early evening hours, rather than in a private home during the morning or late evening hours. And the more serious violent crimes, such as rape and aggravated assault, typically take place after 6 p.m. Now, approximately 2/3 of rapes and sexual assaults occur at night between 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. And less serious forms of violence, such as unarmed robberies and thefts, like purse snatchings, etc., are more likely to occur during the daytime. So kind of, some interesting concepts as we look at the social ecology of crime. So what about seasonal variations then? And yes, that's me surfing right there. I just thought I'd kind of point that out. And if I had some music to play in the background, I would. So there are seasonal variations in victimization. Household property crimes like burglaries have higher rates in the summer and lower rates during other seasons of the year. Auto thefts don't really or do not exhibit the same seasonal patterns. Serious violent victimization rates, which include rape and sexual assault, robbery, and aggravated assault, are significantly higher during the summer than during the winter, spring, and fall. And when all violent crimes are counted, including simple assaults, rates of violence are highest in the fall. And one reason might be that many simple assaults occur in school. And victimization rate patterns correspond to the start of the school year. So, I mean, when kids are out of school during the summertime and it's hot and people are out in the outdoors more, and they might drink more and argue more and etc. So there's all these different issues and things that kind of come into this social ecology of victimization. Well, what about the neighborhood? So we've talked about kind of the weather and things like that, and places, but what about neighborhood characteristics? Well, community factors do and also affect the changes of victimization. So those living, let's say, in the central city experience significantly higher rates of theft and violence than those who live in suburban areas. People living in rural areas have a victimization rate that's about less than half of those in the city. The risk of murder for both men and women is significantly higher in the inner city areas where gangs tend to flourish and drug trafficking is kind of commonplace. So that kind of makes sense. You know, more people, more possibilities of crime. And not only does living in a, let's say, disorganized neighborhood increase victimization risk, but so does the socioeconomic characteristics of surrounding areas. So people who live in and next to poverty-stricken areas are more likely to suffer victimization. Surrounding poverty matters beyond the effect of residential poverty. So victimization risk declines as people move further away from extreme poverty to improved, extended neighborhoods. And that kind of makes sense. And the picture that you're looking at is the difference of a lower income area in Los Angeles and what starts the area and neighborhood of Beverly Hills. So, you know, you can kind of take a look at it and see that there's even a divide in the street. The right side is the more affluent side, and that's the start of this particular city. And the left side is the less affluent side, if you will, and that's the part of Los Angeles. So again, there are some boundaries there that can play a role in this whole victimization type process. Well, what about crime in schools? Schools, unfortunately, are the scene of a great deal of victimization because they are populated by one of the most dangerous segments of society. That would be teenage males. Sorry, guys. The latest data available from the National Center for Educational Statistics found that among students ages 12 to 18, there were about 850,000 non-fatal victimizations at school, which included 363,700 theft victimizations and 486,400 violent victimizations. And during the last school year, 53 students, staff, and non-student school-associated violent deaths occurred, including 41 murders, 11 suicides, and 1 legal intervention death. Now, one reason for the extent of school crime is that adult supervision is typically minimal before, during, and after school. So that's kind of one of the reasons. But again, it's teenage males tend to be driving those particular statistics. So again, we're still in this nature of victimization, and we're going to take a look at the victim household. So the NCVS tells us that within the United States, homes located in urban areas in the South and West are the ones most vulnerable to crime, especially those occupied by African American families. In contrast, European American homes in rural areas in the Northeast and Midwest are least likely to become the targets of crimes such as burglary and larceny. People who own their own homes are less vulnerable than renters. That's kind of an interesting thought. And kind of ask yourself, I'm not going to answer it for you, but why would that be? And also, the population movement and changes may account for recent decreases in crime victimization. U.S. residents have become extremely mobile, moving from, let's say, urban areas to suburban and rural areas. And in addition, family size has been reduced. More people than ever before are living in single person homes, and more people than ever are living in or not marrying. So the proportion of people over 18 who are currently married is about 50%, and that's down about 72% or so from 1960. Over a quarter of all households are now single person, up from 13% in 1960. So again, a lot of information that talks about the victim household. Now let's take a look at, and we're getting closer to the end of this section, victim characteristics. Are there some characteristics that play a role in here? So social and demographic characteristics also distinguish victims and non-victims. And the most important of these factors are age, gender, social status, and race. But we're also going to take a look at marital status, physical and mental traits, and then we'll finish up a little bit looking at repeat victimization. So gender affects victimization risk, except for the crimes of rape and sexual assault. Kind of moving into some of the policy and issues of criminology. Elder victims, especially to kind of look at them. Older adults face risks of things like financial and physical and psychological abuse, and a lot of times these often go unreported. A lot of times family members are often the suspects in these particular cases. And this rapidly increasing elder population does have the potential for increased frequency of abuse of older people. Looking at victims and their criminals, males are typically more likely to be victimized than a stranger. Females are more likely to be victimized by a friend, an acquaintance, or an intimate partner. Most crimes were committed by a single offender over the age of 20. Crimes do tend to be intra-racial, meaning the same race for the most part, not always, of course. And a surprising number of violent crimes are committed by relatives and acquaintances. What are some of the reasons for why males are more likely to be victimized by a stranger than females? Well, again, typically, especially with women, they tend to know a lot of times who the criminal might be. It's somebody that they've already met before. A couple of other characteristics that I want to throw out there before we move into the different theories that are listed there. Go back to gender. Gender affects victimization risk, except for crimes of rape and sexual assault. Males are somewhat more likely than females to be victims of violent crime. Men are almost twice as likely as women to experience robbery. Now, women, on the other hand, are about 10 times more likely than men to be victims of rape or sexual assault, although males are more likely to be victimized than females. The gender difference in victimization has narrowed considerably during the past decade. Now, another significant difference, again, is that women are much more likely to be victimized by someone that they know. We talked about that, or with someone whom they live with. Of those offenders, victimizing females, about 2/3 were described as someone the victim knew or was related to. In contrast, less than half of the male victims were attacked by a friend, relative, or an acquaintance. Now, age, although violent crime rates declined again during, recent years for most age groups, victim data does reveal that young people face a much greater possibility of victimization risk than older people. And teens and young adults experience the highest rates of violence. But even some of the youngest kids are not immune. So, kind of keep that in mind as well. We talked about social status. Americans are the most likely to be victims of violent and property crime. I'm sorry, the poorest Americans. This association occurs across all gender, age, and racial groups. The homeless, who are among the poorest individuals in America, suffer at a very high rate of assault. Similarly, gangs, boys in gangs, those who live in lower class neighborhoods and live a high risk lifestyle are more likely to become crime victims than non-gang affiliated individuals. In contrast, the wealthy are more likely to be targets of personal theft crimes like pickpocketing or purse snatching. And perhaps the affluent, who are more who wear more expensive attire and drive better cars, might attract the attention of thieves. Marital status, again, kind of an interesting thing. Johnny Brickman Wall, a Salt Lake City pediatrician, was recently convicted for killing his ex-wife amid a bitter custody dispute. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison for attacking a 49-year-old woman with a butcher knife. And these were individuals that were married. Considering this turmoil, one might expect that married people have a greater chance of violent victimization than single people, but the data shows kind of quite the opposite effect. Never married males and females are victimized more often than married people, and widows and widowers have the lowest rate of victimization. So, again, kind of interesting. And then to finish up, and we'll jump into the couple of theories. We talk about physical and mental traits. A number of research papers or efforts have found that people who have particular disability traits are more likely to become victimized. These traits include things like being impulsive or risk-taking, or lack of self-control, or low tolerance for frustration. And not only do criminals seek out people with personality deficits, but those with physical disabilities are also at serious risk. And then finally, repeat victimization. Does prior victimization enhance or reduce the chances of future victimization? Individuals who have been crime victims have a significantly higher chance of future victimization than people who have remained non-victims. Kind of interesting. The chances of repeat victimization may relate to lifestyle. So what are some of the factors? What factors predict this chronic victimization or repeat victimization? Well, again, most repeat victimization will occur pretty soon after the previous crime, suggesting that repeat victims share some personal characteristics that make them kind of a magnet, if you will, for criminals. The three things that are kind of indicated that we want to look at would be something called target vulnerability, target gratifiability, and target antagonism. So just to kind of throw that out there. Now, of course, not all victims are repeat victims. Some do take defensive measures to lessen their chance for becoming victims. So with that being said, let's kind of look at victims in their victims theories. So for many years, criminological theory focused on the actions of the criminal offender. We kind of know that. The role of the victim was virtually ignored. Now, more than 60 years ago, scholars began to realize that the victim was not simply a passive target in crime again, but someone whose behavior can influence his or her own fate, who shapes and molds the criminal, if you will. And these early works helped to focus attention on the role of the victim in the crime problem, which led to further research efforts that have sharpened the image of the crime victim. So today, a number of different theories attempt to explain some of those causes of victimization. And the first one is the victim precipitation theory. So according to this theory, some people actually initiate the confrontation that eventually leads to their injury or death. Victim precipitation can be either active or passive. Active participation occurs when victims act provocatively, use threats or fighting words, or even attack first. In contrast, the passive precipitation occurs when the victim was the first to act in the sequence of interactions that led up to the criminal event, meaning the victim encouraged the commission of the crime. Another theory that is out there is something that we call the lifestyle theory. So people may become crime victims because their risky behavior or their risky lifestyle increases their exposure to criminal offenders. Victimization risk is increased by such behaviors as associating with young men, going out in public places late at night, and living in an urban area. Conversely, one's chances of victimization can be reduced by staying at home at night, moving to a rural area, and staying out of public places, earning more money, getting married, etc. The basis of such lifestyle theories is that crime is not a random occurrence. Rather, it's a function of the victim's lifestyle. Now, again, don't get weird about this. These are theories, different theories. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with it. So, again, high-risk lifestyles, people who have high-risk lifestyles like drinking and taking drugs and going out at night and being away from home and living on the street, etc., are going to have a much greater chance of victimization. And that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Another theory that's out there would be something called deviant place theory. And according to this theory, the greater the person's exposure to dangerous places, the more likely people are to become victims of crime and violence. And some communities encourage both crime and victimization. If criminals and victims are one and the same, it's because of where they live and not who they are. Victims are vulnerable because they reside in socially disorganized, high crime areas where they have the greater risk of coming into contact with criminal offenders. So, neighborhood crime levels may be more significant than individual characteristics or lifestyle for determining someone's chances of victimization. So deviant place theory is the view that victimization is primarily a function of where you live. And that's a pretty simple one. I'm going to, I put a couple of these slides in here to show you when you talk about cultures and communities. This is in there because I wanted you to see, I took it from one of my gang classes, but in the city of Compton, it's very unique. In the north end of the city, they have a high school by the name of Centennial, and more in the southern part of the city, they have a high school by the name of Compton High. And if you haven't already figured it out, you can see that one is typically painted in red and the other is painted in blue. And it's significant in the fact of the culture of this particular community at the time. Okay, if you were a blood gang member, you would go to Centennial High School. It did not matter where you lived in the city. And if you were a Crip gang member and affiliate with the color blue, you would go to Compton High School. So without taking up too much time, you can see that the city that you're in sometimes can even be culturally dictate some of these other things. Okay, so let's look at a couple of other theories. Let me go here. Okay, we're going to talk about routine activities theories. So, a series of papers that were written by Lawrence Cohen and Marcus Felsen first articulated this thing called routine activities theory. And here, Cohen and Felsen assume that both the motivation to commit crime and the supply of offenders are constant. Every society will always have some people willing to break the law for revenge, greed, or some other motive. Therefore, the volume and distribution of predatory crime, which means like violent crimes against a person and crimes in which an offender attempts to steal something, are closely related to the interaction of three different variables that reflect the routine activities of the typical American lifestyle. And there's some subheadings that you can see that we're going to cover. But to define this, this is the view that victimization results from the interaction of three everyday factors. The first one is a suitable target. The availability of a suitable target, such as homes containing things that you want to steal that are easily sold, coins, money, stereo equipment, computers, laptops, phones, that kind of stuff that you can easily sell. Number two, the absence of a capable guardian, such as the police, the homeowners, neighborhoods, friends, relatives, etc. And three, the presence of motivated offenders, such as a large group of teenagers or somebody that's hooked on drugs and has to go get their fix, etc. These components together increase the likelihood that a predatory crime will take place and increases the likelihood of victimization. Targets are more likely to be victimized if they are poorly guarded and exposed to a large group of motivated offenders. Increasing the number of motivated offenders and placing them in close proximity to valuable goods will increase property victimizations. And I hope this kind of makes sense. So again, in the slides and in the textbook, it puts these three circles together, and it talks again about the three pieces and how they overlap. And you can see in the center is the crime part. So again, a series of papers were written by these two individuals that came up with this theory called routine activities theory, and it was based on these particular three components. A little bit more that kind of goes into that routine activities theory. Routine activities theory helps explain why U.S. citizens suffer such high rates of victimization. And according to Felsen, and this is just a little bit more info, crime began to increase in the United States as the country changed from a nation of small villages and towns to one of large urban environments. And because metropolitan areas provide a critical population mass, predatory criminals are better able to hide and even evade apprehension. After committing a crime, criminals can blend into the crowd, disperse their stolen property, if you will, and then make kind of a quick escape using public transportation. So that's just kind of one thing. Now, a little bit more. Routine activities theory and lifestyle and the lifestyle approach do have some similarities. They both assume that a person's living arrangement can affect victim risk, and that people who live in unguarded areas at the mercy of motivated offenders. And these two theories, again, they both rely on four basic concepts: proximity of criminals, time and exposure to criminals, target attractiveness, and guardianship. So just, kind of throwing that out there. And in your in your slides, you do have some of those charts. So don't stress out about all the theories and trying to remember them. We list the theories here, and then we have a small definition of the theories here. So it makes it a little bit easier for you to understand. Okay, so we're getting close. We're going to kind of finish up here talking about caring for the victim and some victim service programs. So helping the victim cope is the responsibility of all of society, and law enforcement agencies, courts, and correctional and human service systems have come to realize that due process and human rights exist not only for the criminal defendant, but you know what? Also for the victim of criminal behavior. And because of public concern over violent personal crime, President Ronald Reagan created a task force on victims of crime in 1982, and this group suggested that a balance be achieved between recognizing the victim's rights and providing the defendant with due process. And so as we move into this and we look at a lot of the different services that are there, remember that as a result of this Victims of Crime Task Force in 1982, Congress passed the Omnibus Victim and Witness Protection Act, requiring the use of victim impact statements at sentencing in federal criminal cases, greater protection for witnesses, more stringent bail laws, and the use of restitutions in criminal cases. And then a little later in 1984, the Comprehensive Crime Control Act and the Victims of Crime Act authorized federal funding for state victim compensation and assistance projects. And an additional important milestone was the Crime Victims' Right Act of 2004 that extended crime victims the right to participate excuse me, in the justice system and be informed and consulted on tactics and decisions being used by the Justice Department. So these are all important things, but what about the programs? Well, thousands of victim witness assistance programs have been developed throughout the United States, and these programs are organized on a variety of government levels and serve a variety of different types of clients. So again, the programs, when you talk about these, and we're going to go through them kind of one at a time, just briefly. So victim compensation, a primary goal of victim advocates has been to lobby for legislation creating crime victim compensation programs. And these are financial aid, if you will, awarded to crime victims to repay them for their loss and injuries. And they may cover things like medical bills, lost wages, loss of future earnings, and or even counseling. When you talk about victim advocates, some programs assign counselors to victims to serve as advocates, meaning to help them understand the operations of the justice system and to guide them through the process. So again, these are government programs that help crime victims and witnesses, and they may, it may include some compensation for court services and or things like crisis intervention. We talk about victim impact statements. Every state jurisdiction allows victims to make an impact statement before the sentencing judge, and victim impact statements or information is part of the Federal Crime Act of 1994, in which Congress gave federal victims of violence, violent crime or sexual assault the right to speak at sentencing. And this is important, and you've seen it on TV where before somebody is sentenced, the victims will get up and make their statement about how they feel this particular crime has impacted them. Public education, more than half of all victim programs include public education to help familiarize the general public with their services and with other agencies that can help crime victims. Crisis intervention, well, most victim programs refer victims to specific services to help them recover from whatever ordeal they had to go through. Clients are commonly referred to the local network of public and private social service agencies that provide emergency and long-term assistance with things like transportation, medical care, shelter, food, and clothing. And in addition, more than half of all victim programs do provide this crisis intervention for victims who are feeling isolated or vulnerable or in need of some type of assistance. So crisis intervention is, in fact, emergency counseling for crime victims. Victim offender reconciliation programs, where these are mediators that facilitate face-to-face encounters between victims and their attackers in what we call victim offender reconciliation programs. And the aim here is to engage in direct negotiations that lead to restitution agreements and possibly reconciliation between both parties involved. Victim notification, there have been a number of efforts to notify victims or even potential victims of offender locations. Every state has has sex offender registration to keep potential victims aware of the locations of convicted sex offenders in their community. And in addition, most states have adopted VINE, which is Victim Information and Notification Every Day, a service through which victims of crime can use telephone or internet to search for information regarding their offender's custody status, and also receive a phone call or an email notification when that particular status of that offender changes, like they might be being released. Legal protection for victims, another way that victims have been served is the more rigorous enforcement of laws designed specifically to protect certain classes of victims. Now, for many years, advocates complained that states did not offer adequate protection for domestic violence, sometimes treating these crimes as a private matter. Now, due to the impact of victim advocacy, state courts are now more likely to issue restraining orders or protection orders, which require the accused person to immediately stop stalking or harassing a victim and to stay a certain distance away from their house. So these things are getting a little bit better. Along with this, we have the Victims' Bill of Rights. Because of the influence of victims' rights advocates, every state now has a set of legal rights for crime victims in its code of laws, often called the Victims' Bill of Rights. And you can see what falls down underneath here. We talked about victim advocates a little bit. Ensuring victims' rights may involve a mix of advocacy groups, some independent, others government-sponsored, and some even self-help. And advocates can be especially helpful when victims need to interact with certain government agencies. And advocates can also lobby police departments to keep investigations open and request the return of stolen property, etc. They can also advocate for prosecutors and judges to provide protection from harassment and reprisals by the issuance of these restraining orders, etc. There's also the self-protection portion. Not all actual or potential victims are content with relying on some of the victim services that we just talked about, okay? In order to make them comfortable. Concerns about community safety have prompted some people to, become their own police force, if you want to say that, taking an active role in community protection through the creation of things like Citizen Watch or Neighborhood Watch or crime control groups, or even arming themselves. Other methods of self-protection involve things like target hardening or making your home or business more crime-proof. through locks and bars and alarms and cameras and devices and things like that. And and so that, I mean, there's a lot to talk about victims, and we kind of, I'm going to end it with this is, you know, I have two daughters, and here they are, and of course, being in law enforcement, they are very well adapted to firearms and things like that. And I'm not advocating that, but some people take self-protection to the ultimate end by fighting back when they're attacked. And, you know, this isn't the time to do the gun debate or anything like that. It's the time just to let you know that there are a lot of reasons why criminologists now are taking a harder look at victims and victimization. So I know it was a lot of information. Thanks for hanging in there with me. I went over a little bit long, but I apologize. With that said, that is the end of the Chapter 3 lecture. Don't forget to look at the key terms at the end of the chapter. Also, they're posted on Canvas. And also, don't forget to review those critical thinking questions just to keep your brain moving. And with that being said, again, that's the end of the Chapter 3 lecture. And until next time.